for a sec. So let me turn our attention now to Lauren Tedesco, who is the Senior Vice President at the Automotive Parts Manufacturing Association here in Ontario. Lauren, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Apologies for the time crunch. I'm also looking at the doorknob. I'm at a friend's house with all my children downstairs begging to come in the door. So I apologize if we get a rogue child to jump in on this. But yes, thank you. Thank you for having me. And thank you, Angelo and Dina as well. And even just listening to your presentations, I have questions for you that I will probably follow up with on separately, just hearing kind of the perspective from your side of things. I work with the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association, a mouthful. I'll call it APMA from this point forward. We represent parts makers in automotive across Canada. And so we don't represent the car manufacturers like the Fords and the GMs. We really represent anyone who's providing parts or services, technology, supplies to the automotive sector and creating those parts. Our employment numbers, I will say pre-pandemic, because I'm not sure what those numbers are right now, but pre-pandemic, they were roughly around 100,000, largely based here in Ontario, although we do represent across Canada, and our members are 90% of the independent parts production. So of that kind of 100,000 employees, and when we look at our membership, really about 80% of those companies are small or medium-sized businesses. So looking at 100 and less or 500 or less employees. We do have a number of very large employers as well, but the majority are the small and medium size. Just a bit of a snapshot, I guess, of what else that our industry kind of looks like, because I think that a lot of the time, at least in my work, when we're trying to attract new workforces into the sector, there is very much the idea that it's the greasy, dirty, dark, dingy places of the past, and many of our facilities are state of the art. We definitely need to do some more marketing around that when we do our attraction. But there has been a real generation shift in the sector, very different from what our parents or grandparents may have worked in. And it really does span everything from entry level and general labor right up to engineering and design and AI, for example. Most of the workers in the auto parts space, I would say that they are in production. So they're on the assembly line, they're on the plant floor in those facilities. And about 18 or 19% of that workforce is unionized. So we are, I think, a bit unique in that we do have hybrid models. Sometimes people are unionized, sometimes they are not. But it also, that could be within the same organization. It could be one plant or facility is unionized, but another one isn't. And so we're seeing all different models taking place. So it's very unique in that way, in the way that we navigate some of our workforce issues. I took lots of notes, so bear with me. And then just in terms of diversity in the automotive parts manufacturing sector. So women currently represent about 25%. We're a little bit higher than the car manufacturers. Young women about 7%, immigrants 10%, visible minorities 11%, and Indigenous only 0.6%. When we talk about the automotive parts, we do represent our Canadian suppliers, but we have to remember that we are borderless, I'll say, across North America, because we do see a lot of head offices here in Mexico or the US or in Canada. And it's very easy for organizations to pick up and move across those borders. So that's something that just to kind of keep in mind as I kind of talk about some of the questions that were proposed to me to answer today, is that we are constantly balancing across 3 different jurisdictions. This isn't something that is Canadian only, although when we look at legislation or we look at different policies that come in place, it is a very Ontario or Canadian perspective, and how we balance that against, say, the US or Mexico, for example. In terms of our kind of like higher landscape, we are really on I'm going to say we're on the verge. We are in the middle of an industrial shift, the biggest one that's probably happened since we saw the assembly line take place over 100 years ago. We're seeing electric vehicles now with new kind of mandates set out by the federal government, and seeing the investments that are taking place across not just auto parts, but from governments as well. And it's really changing the nature of our workforce. Jobs that exist today will not exist in 5 to 10 years. And that's just not, you know, a anecdote to say, it really truly is, because anyone who is currently building exhaust pipes or a fuel tank, that is not the future that we are looking towards in 5 to 10 years. And so those jobs will be gone. And then there's also new jobs that are taking place now and that will exist. So it really is a high area of change right now. And then in addition, seeing the workforce and seeing a high number of retirements from people who have worked in there for 30, 35 years, and trying to attract new generations into our space. And then obviously with the pandemic, we saw our world get set on fire pretty much, and then being able to accommodate the changes to that. So automotive was deemed an essential service. So it was only a matter of weeks before our sector went back to work after the pandemic. And that really changed the nature of what work on the assembly line, on the production floor, in our plants looked like. And they had to pivot. A lot of them, we were very fortunate, I would say, in that our industry was able to pivot towards making PPE and ventilators. But at the same time, some very difficult discussions around what does health and safety in the workplace look like, and how do we return to parts production? How do we have a hybrid approach and make sure that we're increasing health and safety, because it was not just our facilities, it was across the US and Mexico, and then worldwide as well. So some of these organizations had to take real leadership when there wasn't much happening, I say from higher levels or from governments. So I hope that gives you a bit of a snapshot of our workforce and some of the things we've been dealing with and the changes that have come down the pipeline. I know one of the questions, I just have it here, is about, the issues of employee participation and representation in decision-making. And so how is that managed by our members? So some have unions, some have employee associations, and some use high-performance work systems. So we very much, I deep dive with several employers. I definitely think that, timelines give much more room for consultation. But in speaking with a few large, a few small, and one that does have unionized staff, oftentimes we think we're more different than we are alike, and that's not necessarily the case. Everyone has the same issues, no matter what the model might be for a workforce. There's no one formula that will fit this. And sometimes I wish that I used to work in government. Sometimes it's easier if we could find one formula that just checks off a box to be able to bring forward that change. But there really is no one right formula. We see so many different models, even unionized versus non-unionized, in one workplace. And it really just depends on the nature of the employer. Our large employers, they have fantastic resources. They have entire teams that can be dedicated to employee resource groups, or to be able to put together, an employee panel or have an employee advocate. But when we look at the small and medium size, that's where we really see that sometimes it is just they're resource strapped and they don't know where to find information, or they're so busy head down trying to meet the quotas and the targets of the day that they're not looking up to look at that broader context. It's just survival mode in that day to day. A few pieces that came back. Again, sorry, I'm former life communication, so I take notes like crazy. But a few things that happened when I talked to some of those organizations during the pandemic, that is really what changed. Not that it was there is always room for improvement, no question, but the pandemic really put a spotlight on where the gaps were and where conversations needed to happen in any given facility, any plant. It really is structured there. You have things that happen with the plant manager and come down, but it really is looking at team to team and division to division. There's a high level of communication in those spaces because when you're looking at each person on the assembly line, they have earplugs in, they have headphones on, they are in their own designated area with tape lines on the floor for safety reasons. There is not the same level of communication that happens in a lot of other workplaces. There is also a lot of the time not the ability, you know, I work in an office now, it's very easy for me to walk down the hall and chat with someone or check in to say, how are things going for you today? Or where are we seeing the issues? Or maybe we can organize this committee. We have the time to do that. But when you're looking at a lot of these workers on the ground floor that are on the front lines in the plant, there is not that ability or space or time to do that. And so how can we find ways to increase that communication at the ground level? And so a lot of, I'd say, larger organizations have done a good job of that, being able to put in those pulse checks, to issue like a global, I say global, it might just be within their plant or in the higher head office, have a global policy or position or new initiatives, but it really is an effort that it trickles down and there's checkpoints along the way where, you know, you red, yellow, or green light them, you deep dive into areas that are not performing or where you're getting negative feedback. And especially during the pandemic, they really wanted to create, you know, people had the option with some of our very big organizations, whether to stay home or whether to come back because it was limited return, but how to talk to people because they were worried about their family. So it opened up beyond just the worker. It really became more of that, you know, the safety of the family, the person who has, you know, an elderly mother at home who's high risk, et cetera. So that was a lot of the legwork. And even when I was here at APMA, it's just being able to bring that together. Same approach when it comes to things like equity, diversity, inclusion, which are, there's no question that our sector is behind on that when you look at a lot of others. And there's more discussions and education happening, but same idea where you have a, I'm trying to think of what he had said about think global and act local, because it really is the on the ground. How is this going to impact the worker? And so finding those solutions. And in the non-unionized environments, that sense of there are no structures in place. And so how can we put those structures in place? Or how can we put additional resources to be able to set out those pathways? So it really is a multi-pronged approach. It could be surveys, it could be committees, it could be formal that way, or it's also informal when we're looking at different touch points throughout the day. I would also say that a lot of our organizations do have an open door policy because, again, this is like looking at production line work, but when there are issues, you want the agility to solve problems quickly because if a line goes down, and so how do you empower workers to make decisions on the job? So if they're not feeling safe, they're not going to be as productive. And so being able to create those spaces where someone can come forward to say, I don't feel safe in this model, I don't feel safe in this space, but very much also not to put the onus on them, but to say, tell me what creates a safer space for you. And that constant feedback cycle that happens, because really at the end of the day, a lot of our companies are focused on, you know, the unit price, and it's so highly competitive and they can't upsell a product. We are very much, you know, you bid on a contract and you're making a cup holder for $1.25. There is no wiggle room around that, and you need to meet your quotas. And so the idea that we need to have very productive assembly lines really drives home the conversations that happen on that assembly line about where do we find productivity, where do we find health and safety, where do we find improvements on that line for that person on the job and in their personal life and the supports that happen. I would say though that we do need where we can find more supports or best practices or conversations to help small and medium-sized organizations, because you know, there are places that we've reached out to talk about some of our programs, and the person who is answering the phone is also doing HR, handling logistics, and doing payroll, right? It's a small organization of 10 or 20, oftentimes family run, oftentimes in a small community, and they may be one of the, you know, backbones of that community and one of the big employers, even though they're still relatively small. And so a lot of the time it is education, right? They just don't know. They're not reading up on legislation, or they're not understanding what the changes mean. They don't have the bandwidth to implement those things. And that's a lot of the role that we do at APMA, being able to kind of digest that information, look for programs, or be able to support them on the ground. But it is really important that there is that gap on the employer side, no question. Or as employees move through the organization, how do we help them in their leadership roles so they understand, if they're acting on behalf of the employer, how do you support those employees? Because we do have a lot of legacy employees throughout the sector as they move through. And then I would also say, sorry, I'm just making sure, because I'm sure I slid right into the second question. So APMA, in terms of us having a preferred model, there definitely is no preferred model. So many different models work, and there's so many different needs, especially as the sector changes towards electric vehicles and we have more technology. When we see union versus non-union, both work. And when we see those hybrid models happening in one organization, it works. And so we don't have a preferred model, but I think that what we do have is we've seen workers' rights from the 70s and 80s. They have been effective in seeing that evolution take place. We are definitely not near the end of that evolution. It will continue to grow, especially as our sector changes and the world changes. But the standard has improved, and our companies continue to do that work, and they're very open and accepting to those ideas when we can do some hand-holding there, right? When they see big changes, it's another burden that falls on them and that they just don't know how to implement on the ground floor, in addition to balancing the other pieces of their business. Large organizations, no question, they have experts for that, right? And sometimes we lean on them for their insight and advice. But when we look at 80% of the sector are those small and medium-sized businesses, how can we help them find those different paths or those different models that will work for them? And I'll say, just on kind of my last point here, so I looked through some of those recommendations or the draft recommendations that were put forward. I think when we look at employer initiatives, the voice models like worker management committees and work councils, I think these are all great ideas about how organizations can do it on the ground floor. Setting up a committee, what does that look like? And here's the couple of steps. I saw in the other section about racism, discrimination, and bullying. That's something that even we're doing as our workforce changes, and we're really trying to drive through, like our EDI fund, for example. How do we get those who have been historically excluded into the sector, and how do we support them? And we've created a fund where, mental health supports and training on the job and mentorship. And in our last round, supporting even funds for transportation to get to and from work. But easing that transition into a space that is completely new because they have been excluded. But it does take the education piece too for us to provide on the employer side. And then the one last one, I promise this is it, but looking at, I know someone recommended an app. We are launching a digital learning program, and we have a great divide in our sector where we do have an aging workforce that is retiring. And we also have a lot of young people coming into the space, especially on the technology side of things. There is no one size fits all when it comes to technology. We're trying to sell our digital learning program as the Netflix of training, because these are words that we know that create comfort on that user experience. But when we look at examples of how to do this at the employee level, I think that within automotive, we've seen first, these people are not on computers all day. Even some of their smartphones are outdated, or you can't access Wi-Fi within your organization. We need solutions that are accessible, and we continue to work to do that. But the makeup of the industry and the changes that are happening, we're just, really just doing our best to try to support across that entire spectrum.
All right. Thank you so much, Lauren, for that perspective. I assure you, you're not the only one who may have small children right outside the door trying to get in. I know that's true of some of our
not
members.
making eye contact, so
and myself as well. But thank you for that. Almost really illuminating to have a kind of almost case study of what APMA has tried and how you navigate this space around worker voice amid a shifting workforce, a shifting industry, changing economy, etc. Gives a lot of people, I think, a sense of what, how many forces are at play and how many things we have to consider. At this point, 20 minutes from time, I want to open the floor to anyone who has a question for our guests. Feel free to direct it at Lauren specifically, or Dina and Angelo as well, if they're still with us. But we want to get as many people a chance as they can to interact with you. So I see Brett, your hand is up, and then Dennis, you'll be next. And please feel free, anyone else to, and Stephen, you'll be after that. 1, 2, 3. So Brett, please feel free to go ahead.
Sorry, my question was for Dina earlier, but that was a wonderful presentation. I'm extremely happy about it. I don't really have a question at this time. I'm kind of just absorbing everything that was just said. Okay. I just left my hand up because I thought we might be going back to Dina. So go ahead with somebody else.
No worries, and we can circle back to you again if you want, Brett. Dennis, let me let you go ahead, and then Stephen.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was great. I think it gives us a much better understanding of so much of our local conditions. And I fail to see how we can really get the government to do anything else but sponsor more things like what you are doing. It would be very difficult for government to achieve what you are doing without such an organization such as you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. And yeah, a lot of our work has been, we look at the federal and provincial level, and because most of our sector operates here in Ontario. And I will say that when we work with like the Center for Automotive Diversity out of the US, when they see the programs that we're able to put forward, it is very unique compared to what happens in the US, and the support that does come from government. It's a good time to be in automotive. There's no question, because everyone is excited about the future. But part of that is advocating, well, how do we support that workforce through that change? Because it will be monumental, and we don't want to lose the workers that we currently have. And we want to make sure that we're also supporting and attracting the new ones to come into this space as well.
Thank you. Let me turn to Stephen, and then Amir Mohammed after that.
Hello, can you hear me?
All good.
Yes.
All right. Well, you did a very good presentation, and I noticed that you deal with employees, and you say that they're confined, basically being taped off, and they're in their production hour after hour, and meeting so many units, so they don't have much of a voice. And then second, you deal with unions, and third, you deal with governments. So of the three, which do you feel is the most difficult to communicate with? I would think it's the government, but and if so, I was thinking, based on which the most difficult to communicate with, and perhaps it's all of them, could it be prioritized about addressing problems to them? And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. So I wouldn't say, each has pros and cons. We have a great relationship with Unifor. It was actually my president who introduced me to Angelo the other day. And there's a longstanding history, because we're also in a unique position. We don't sit across from the bargaining table with Unifor. We represent employers, we represent our membership. And so we don't get involved in collective bargaining, but we very much work with Unifor, talk to them, and especially when it comes to their research, because it's exceptional and they have a much bigger team than we do. So we do find those partnerships, and a lot of the time it is just communication and being able to come together, because there's so many different audiences that you have to take into consideration across the automotive sector. Full disclosure, I used to work in politics, but in a different government. And you know, when you have worked in government, it's very easy to understand how to communicate with them, where our employers don't have that same benefit if they needed some sort of support or if they wanted to go to government. And that's why we have the association. And that's why we have the expertise and the skill set that we do, because me knocking on the door to say, hey, here's a great example of a program that we need versus a company trying to come forward and collectively do that, very different approach. I will say that it's also a balance, right? When you work with government, there are things that, of course, we would disagree with, and there are things that are great for the auto sector, and they're fantastic investments. And so it's understanding our priorities and also balancing the voices of our workforce and our employers, because they're so huge. I think our greatest asset right now is that our employers are very open to coming forward with the issues that they're dealing with. So there's no surprise, there's a massive labor shortage across Canada. It is highly competitive to try to get talent into the space. And I think when we look at our employers, if they don't have continuous improvement, then they are not able to keep their workforce, or they're being passed over. And so they are making adjustments and learning the new ways of new talent that comes in. And sometimes they have to come forward to us to say, here's where we're finding the biggest hardships, or here's where we're finding gaps. And with our EDI fund, for example, that was a huge one where they said, we just don't have enough people. And quite frankly, they don't want to use temp agencies. Half the time they're like, we don't know if they're legit. We don't have the knowledge to be able to figure out how these systems work. We don't want people just coming in and coming out. We want to hire them full time. These jobs sit empty, and they are increasing hourly wage or improving benefits, and trying to make those adjustments. And I think the last thing is that you mentioned about, you know, because they are on a production line, and safety comes first above all else, right? Because anything happens on that floor, you're shutting down, and there's an injury on the line, and that's on the employer. And so a lot of our facilities, it really is putting that forward. And so they have to drive even more communications, because it doesn't happen naturally on the job, on the plant floor. They have to go above and beyond to create those spaces, or pull them off and create that time separately, because it's not organic to the sector overall.
All right, thanks, Stephen. I'm going to give our last question to Mohammed. Amer, do you want to go ahead with your question, and we'll circle back once more to thank our three guests.
Yeah, hello. Actually, my question goes to all the three speakers. Whoever want, they can answer. So I'm pretty impressed that unions do a lot of work, but there are a lot of employees and groups who are really away from the benefits of union. So do you really make any effort to actually expose the benefit of union to such employees who because of their employment nature are far away from the unions, and actually make them encourage them to enroll with your union so that they can be benefited and protected for the job safety and other things? Do you have any strategy like that?
So I will just say I won't answer that question, because it doesn't necessarily apply, because we don't get involved in that level.
Yeah.
So I will defer to Dina and Angelo on that.
Dina, did you want to go ahead?
Sure. Absolutely. I mean, when workers come to us and they're trying to figure out what to do around a workplace problem, we have to explore all the different kinds of aspects of, you know.
No, I am asking you, going to the employees, what efforts you make to actually reach those employees or those employer areas where actually there are no unions.
Yeah,
like in the first lecture,
yeah.
He was very, I appreciate him bringing one interesting thing forward, that a lot of professional people, when they come out of their profession, I mean training, and they go into the job, they don't even think that it is a job. They are still in the virtual world of a professional practice,
Yeah.
and they end up in troubles. So a lot of the kind of things are there. So that kind of professionals, or maybe that kind of employees who are unaware that a union exists, or they can also get a union. So what kind of approach you make to reach them who are actually void of this benefit?
Yeah, so we do get people who are professionals who come to our center. And so part of exploring how to deal with the problem that they have at work is also about talking about unionization. We also we reach thousands of people every year through doing workplace know your rights workshops. So these are the places where in immigrant settlement sectors, in libraries, in community centers, where a whole bunch of people are coming into the country or entering the labor market and are not sure about what their rights are. And so part of the conversation we have is around employment standards, but also how to unionize. So you can have a variety of people in the workshop that we're in. Some are professionals, a lot of people are coming from overseas, and their credentials are not accepted here in this country, and so end up in jobs such as manufacturing and gig work. So so yeah, absolutely, that is part and parcel of the educational programs that we run.
And maybe I can just supplement that. If there's time, Richard, you let me know.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. So yeah, and just kind of picking on that, but from a union's perspective on this, like you have to appreciate we have an entire division of the union, dozens and dozens of staff who work day and night having these conversations with workers. Sometimes it's conversations that we initiate. Other times it's conversations that workers come to us to initiate, and sometimes it's very cut and dry. Other times it's workers who aren't sure exactly either how possible it is to unionize their workplace and whether or not their coworkers share that view. So this is an ongoing discussion that happens within the union. We do have an actual structure within the union. It's one of our council bodies of technical and office and professional workers, and this is a platform of existing engineers, scientists, academics within our union, represented by Unifor, that have a place to come together to talk about those specific issues, and they become an interesting conduit for workers interested in joining. So that's just something folks I'm not sure are fully aware of. And then the last thing I'll say is when Unifor was formed back in 2013, one of the objectives of the union, even the name, and I was on the committee who came up with the name, was this idea to appeal to a wider audience of workers, not be the chemical workers union or the auto workers union or the rubber workers union. It was going to be a union for everybody, and we wanted people to see Unifor as a platform for organizing wherever it was they worked. And we know the limitations. I talked about them in our current models of industrial relations. And so one of the novel ideas and programs that we came out with when Unifor was formed was a program called our Community Chapters program. And so what this was intended to do was to provide workers who had a community of interests who, for whatever reason, were not able to secure collective bargaining rights in their workplace. And this was an entry point into how to gain access to union resources, union democracy, and have an emphasis of voice. And it's been somewhat successful. We're hoping to push this program forward over the coming years, but we're talking about everyone from a group of Canadian freelance workers who are independent contractors, no stable employment, but come together, hundreds of them, to organize within Unifor, but also as far as ministers of the United Church have come together to form a community chapter. So go figure, and a number of others in between. So these are other kind of platforms of building worker voice, worker power, and I didn't have a chance to get into too much detail in my opening remarks, but I'm glad to speak to it now.
Thanks so much, Angelo and Dina. Before we let you go, I just want to ask one last question, kind of on behalf of the Assembly, but as you know, they'll be producing a report at the end of this with some detailed recommendations of these policies that we're all wrestling with. And I just want to ask in closing, since you are among the target audience, the core audience for this report, and you'll be looking it over, you have a great interest in this, what is either one thing that you'll be looking for in that report, or one lingering or one lasting piece of advice you'd like to give to the Assembly as they move into that stage, whether that's in tone or in substance, general, specific? What are you going to be looking for? What's your biggest hope out of this? Angela, why don't you go first and I'll go to Dina.
It's a tricky one because I think this whole exercise is quite unique. And I guess just from my perspective of coming at this as a trade unionist and someone who sees, there's a strong interest in watching unions grow, and I stand by my comments about when we talk about what is power, what is voice. The role of unions as collective organizations to do this work is essential. Everything else seems to kind of operate in my mind on the periphery. So it's where this group lands on that question. What is the role of unions in this? Because if the results from you folks come out that unions are an important but small part of expanding worker voice, to me that also raises a series of questions about the future of unions. And so I look forward to that, but just look forward to seeing this process unfold. And congratulations to all of you for this tremendous work.
Thanks.
So,
Dina.
so for me, I mean, I'm really looking to make sure that the reality that faces workers in workplaces and in our communities and in the labor market are reflected in your report. I think it's, and I think that's one of the reasons why I made my presentation the way I did, because I think that, to sort of separate voice and power from the structural forces that are the context within which our workplaces are in, I think will completely miss the point. And I think if you have a conversation around mechanisms for workplace voice without understanding the deep structural ways in which workers are not even considered to be part of workplaces and the limitations for their voice, such as, immigration status, I think will not do this report any service. And I think that, I think I sometimes see a lot of recommendations come out with an absolute lack of understanding of the realities that face workers. And I think if anything we've learned during the pandemic, there is a difference between workers who got to stay home and take care of themselves and workers who had no choice but to go to work. And I think if we don't understand issues of power and choice, and that is going to be a real issue in the recommendations that you provide. And I think that to understand the realities of the fact that we almost have 50% of workers who have a precarious connection to their employer, if we also do not understand that, then what we're doing is creating recommendations for the privileged core of workers that are in workplaces and ignoring almost 50% of people that are on the peripheral and are on the edge, but who are actually the ones who do the essential work in our economy. So that's what I'm going to be looking for, and I'm very clear on that. And I'm really hoping that, and I'm sort of hopeful by the comments that I've heard by the committee members, that you will do what you need to do to understand and to put that reality forward and represent the workers that I'm talking about in the best way possible, because they're the ones that need your support, okay? They don't have a union. They don't have any power. They don't have a voice. They need your support to fight for the kinds of changes that will deal with the kind of fundamental structural unfairness that is built into the labor market and in their workplaces. So those are the people that I'm thinking about, and I hope those are the people that you will think about when you make your deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dina and Angelo. I know we had to lose Lauren. She had to rush back to her event, but we're so glad to have your perspective with us.